What is up, everybody? I wanted to film this video for you guys today. This is how to assemble a late 30s junior transmission. Basically it's this. So I'm not covering disassembly, but disassembly is the reverse of reassembly, and the reassembly is harder. So if you don't know how to disassemble it, you can watch this video and then you'll know how to disassemble it and reassemble it. Pretty simple. So I'm not really sure what years in all this is applicable to. I'll have to ask around. I don't work on these transmissions all the time, so it's not like I've seen like a 42 and a 46 and a 48, and like I don't really know what the applicability all is in terms of how different they all were. But manual transmissions are only so different from each other, so I assume this will have a fair amount of applicability, not just to the 30s cars, but also to the later cars. So the first thing we're going to do is assemble the countershaft setup here. So this entire thing is just one piece of steel. We have this spacer in here and these two kind of spacer rings as well. You can see that these rings have a slight bevel on them. At least one does. I don't know if the bevel actually matters, but we can see based on the wear pattern. I would put the bevel next to this spacer if this one has a particularly noticeable bevel on it. I'm not even sure if they're really supposed to have one. But anyway, so the first thing we're going to do is stick the spacer in and stick these two things in with the bevel facing in, if there's a prominent bevel on it. Stick this on the other side. You want to count your pins here. For all of these transmissions in the 35 to 37 parts book, these all have exactly 50 pins. You want to look in the parts book and see how many you are supposed to have. So what we can do, now that stuff's actually shifting around in there, so we could have put it in later. But what we're going to do is take some grease and put that in here. That's going to hold all of our pins in. So for these transmissions with the brass synchros, any sort of brass, you do not want to use extreme pressure oil, hypoid oil. You cannot use that at all. It will tear up the synchros. What you want to use is Napa GL1 oil. Now, the question is, if you have, for example, this sort of grease, it's EP grease. I don't know if that is okay to use. I would assume it is. One, because it doesn't smell the same. It clearly does not have the same additive package. Second, you're only going to use, maybe a couple ounces of grease, and it's going to be diluted well past 10:1 once you put the actual gear oil in. So I would assume that would be fine, but to be safe, we're going to pull out some lithium grease. This is a very standard type of grease. It's not going to hurt anything. So we're just going to stick our grease right in there. There we go. Don't need to be stingy with it. And this is what's going to hold all the pins in place. So like I was saying before, we use 25 pins on each side. There's really nothing to it. You just shove all the pins in the grease here. All right, now we have all our needle bearings in here. So I'm holding the spacer in here to get these kind of, you can see I can push all those forward there. So we're gonna set these in here until they are level. You can get them recessed a little bit and then push on the spacer to square them all up. Doesn't have to be perfect right now. We got a couple that are dropping out. Don't want that to happen if you can help it. And I did double check that I have exactly 25 pins in here. You're not going to be able to put more than 25 in, but it is possible to accidentally have less than 25. So those are all pretty well squared up now. Got plenty of extra grease. Smear on that. Okay. We're going to set that down. And then this other spacer fell out. No big deal. Slide that back in, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. All right, next we are going to install the countershaft cluster into the transmission. And it's sort of dark in there, so I turned up the camera exposure. Hopefully it doesn't look too stupid. But I want to first show you that there's some thrust washers that go on the end of the countershaft. There is a bronze washer, and then there is a steel washer on top of that. And I'll show the camera here. We got the bronze and the steel. And as you can see, there's a notch in the bronze one. The notch goes into a mating notch in the case right there. So those are not going on right this second. I just want to show you because we were going to put those on later. So to get our countershaft in place, you want to first ensure that your needle bearings have not shifted out of place. Those are perfectly good there. They're in a nice, neat stack. Same thing on the other side. So what we're going to do is drop this in place, and we're putting our shaft in from the right. Now, this green here, or I should say we're putting it in like from the rear of the car. This is the rear side of the transmission. This end here with the notch, that goes on the rear side. So we're putting the unnotched end in first. So we have our counter shaft cluster squared up with that end. And we're going to insert our counter shaft and very carefully get it so that it's, there we go, going through our needle bearings there. And by squaring up the counter shaft with that end, it makes it very easy to insert because it's square with the shaft. By squaring up the cluster with the case, it's square with the shaft. So we just have to translate the position until we find it. That one happened pretty fast. It might take you a little longer if it's your first time. Don't worry about that. And then on the other side here, I can just stick my finger in here and make sure that all of our bearings, our needle rollers, are in their proper locations, their proper home. And there we go. We have our counter shaft, the shaft itself, all the way through, and it's pretty much like touching this part of the case is basically where it's at. So now what we're going to do is push the counter shaft cluster there this way, and we're going to push our needle bearings in. I'll move the camera over here a little bit. Oh, I shouldn't have moved it. Let's zoom in. This might not even, okay, you can see it there. Just barely on camera. Okay, so we're pushing our needle bearings in there. Whoops, let me zoom in a little more. Whoops. This is what happens when I have the camera right in front of my face. Okay. All of our needle bearings, you can see my finger in there. So we're going to take the thrust washer pack here and just stick that in there. Make sure it clears all of our needle bearings. Very good. And it has to be rotated to the correct position. There we go, so that the notch lines up. And you really can't see that on camera. You can tell the notch is lined up because this has not much play there. Well, I mean, you can see it. It doesn't show very well on camera. It's just the same thing I was showing earlier. There we go. Once that is lined up, you can just take your counter shaft assembly and push it over there. And then you can use your finger. I'm going to zoom back out now. You can use your finger in here and get those thrust washers lined up, and we can push our shaft all the way through here. A lot of times this needs a little bit of help lining up all the way. See, the shaft is hitting the case there. So I need to just adjust my position of the counter shaft assembly here. Get this shaft to clear all the way. This is very difficult to do with the camera in front of me. What I'm going to do is just, okay, hold on. Okay, no big deal. I forgot when I was taking this transmission apart. So the shaft on here is like a slight press fit when it's a slip fit on this side. I don't know if that's normal or if that's just a quirk of this transmission. But all we have to do now is get the thrust washers in on that side. So we're going to do the same thing, except I'm just going to take a punch and drive the counter shaft in a little too far, just so that I have enough space to slip the thrust washers in, and without disturbing my bearing rollers, and then just push it back to where it's supposed to be over here. Basically the same thing we already did. We're just shifting the shaft more that way now, sliding the thrust washer in, shifting the shaft back. All right, now we got our counter shaft in. We can see that rotates perfectly smoothly. There's really no extra space anywhere for one of those bearing rollers to hide. So you would have problems or this thing being completely jammed up if those were not in place. The other thing is you want to, now this was already like chipped. Let me reset the brightness here. This was already chipped when I got this transmission in. You can actually see they painted over the chip mark in the past. But what you want to do is you take your lock plate and you want to make sure that your lock plate is indexed properly to where the hole actually is. This one's almost perfect. That should be good enough. This is what it looks like if it's not chipped. You can see there's a little cutout there. People usually chip these by hammering on it by accident, so don't do that. I mean, obviously you have to hammer it in, but don't hammer it where the little cutout is. Hopefully that was obvious, but whatever. I mentioned it now if I forgot to mention it before. Next, we are going to install the reverse gear. There's really nothing to it. We're going to take some pre-lubricant here. You can use standard gear oil. Again, do not use any hypoid oil, but standard gear oil is fine. But I'm using, this is a combination of automatic transmission fluid and STP oil treat. The reason why, just because it's really, really lubricant-y, and you can use it on anything. You can use it on rear axles, gear, what am I trying to say? Rear axles, transmissions, engines, it works for everything. All we have to do, so what I did is just lubricated the bushing in there. I suppose you would want to check first if the bushing has a reasonable fit. There's very little play in there. That's perfectly fine. Normally it's not going to wear out unless you have no oil left in the thing. So we just mesh the reverse gear with the counter shaft, and then we can insert our reverse gear shaft. And then the only other thing is, like before, we need to make sure that our plate is lined up before we drive the shaft in all the way. There we go. That's lined up there. And again, you want to make sure you are not hitting next to the notch. Other than that, there's not much to it. You can double check that your reverse gear is turning properly. Move the camera out of the way here, but yeah, that's all there is to it. And then what I like to do is when this gets close, is I'll stick my lock plate in there and give it a couple final hits. I just don't want to I want to make sure I'm not going past where the lock plate goes. Otherwise I'll have to start, driving it out from the other side with a punch, which is not too fun. By the way, I guess that's because I'm only showing the reassembly. Yeah, how you get this out is you just drive it with a punch from this side. So, no big deal. First thing I should discuss is here we have our synchro. A lot of times this is the part that will wear out on the transmission. So I'll give you guys a close look. This is a new old stock synchro. So you can see down there. Let me look at the other side's easier to see. They're the same, but the other side's harder. Okay, so you can see how there's that that gap down there. It's, I don't know, 1/4, right, of the total amount. I'll get a number on that. I'll measure it with my caliper. But if you see this worn down and there's not much left there, then you're probably just about out of synchro. So the purpose of the synchros, as hopefully you are aware, is that when you are sliding this around to shift gears, this is basically just a conical clutch that will get the will slow the engine down or speed it up to match the wheel speed. It doesn't really transmit the actual engine force. The meshing of the gears will do that, but the synchro helps you out so you don't have to double clutch. How you know if you have a worn synchro is you'll more or less just act like you don't have a synchro. You have to double clutch or whatever. You can shove that up there, and we can see that that is pretty close. I'm gonna zoom in here. Pretty close to 141. It's not perfect. I think my shim stack's just slightly taller. But that's just there to give you a reference point for how worn out yours is. All right, guys. Now we are moving on to the final assembly of the transmission. So we have our synchronizer here, and then we have the input shaft and the output shaft assemblies. That's the main the main parts we are working with here. The first step is we will take our input shaft and set it over there. Then we take the output shaft. We're going to pre-lubricate the splines a little bit. Now you notice there's some light flash rusting on this. I was looking at that. It's really not coming off easily, and it's not, and where it is isn't going to interfere with the transmission operation. You know, I was sitting with some wire brushes. It's pretty well stuck on there. So even though there's some discoloration, that's not like flaking rust. There's very little, you know, actual rust or anything on there. Make sure you don't forget to put your low and reverse gear on. There we go. And then this goes in the output side of the transmission. All right, we have a little bit of space to work with here. So next we can install our synchronizer. You have to make sure this is towards the front. So if you have this up at this angle, you can work like this. Then you need to be very sure you include a couple of important items. One, there is a spacer ring. This is 125 wide, or sorry, 1.25 wide and 119 thick overall, just wire. So you can take some 119 wire and bend it into a ring that is about 1 1/4 wide, stick it on there. And we have our roller ball bearing here. Again, some discoloration on it, but nothing major. This I already pre-lubricated with our transmission pre-lubricant, as we do. Then you can mate these two parts and mesh the gears. There we go. Next up, we have two bearings. We're not going to put the front one on for now. I just want to show you the comparison. So the front one, as you can see, has a shield on it. So you can see balls, shield. The rear one just has balls. So the front one I have packed with more of that lithium grease. We're going to use that later. The rear one is open on both sides, so it gets lubricated with transmission oil. With gear oil, in other words. I like to take these snap rings off when cleaning. It's really easy to get them off and on. You just kind of pry them off with a screwdriver, and to put them on, you just kind of, you know, run around like that. Nothing to it. Then to get this on, it's basically a slip fit, but it's a fairly tight slip fit. So you can use a hammer or something just to tap it on. And we're using very light taps here because we have these gears. We don't want to mess anything up. But this is just very light taps just to get this going. It's not going to Brunel the bearing or anything like that. There we go. And then once we have this all the way up here, we center up the bearing with the bore. Make sure everything is still in mesh here. So we can mesh that. The reason why this is too far forward is because our bore is not all the way into the bearing. But so we hold the bearing here, and we can gently tap that farther into place. You don't want to tap too hard because you'll kind of jam your synchronizer a little bit. But once that gets a little better, we can start to tap the bearing into the bore. Is it centered up properly? It's almost centered up, but obviously it has to be exactly centered up to be able to start tapping it in. There we go. And then, let's see if we can move this gear out of the way. Come on now. This gear actually helps us support the shaft a little bit. But with the gear out of the way, we can keep tapping the shaft in to the bearing. Keep tapping the bearing into the bore. We will just continue like that. One other thing is that once the shaft is mostly in, or once the bearing is mostly in, we can get them in all the way by installing this rear cover. So I'll show that. For now, I'm going to tap the bearing in a little more. It's actually going in quite smoothly. Of course, having some lubricant on this stuff helps quite a bit. There we go. Bearing's actually in all the way already. This shaft, I'm going to pull it in the rest of the way by installing the yoke on the end there. So first, what we do is we take our rear cover. We have a seal here. This is very, very easy. If you need to replace it, you just drive it out, push the new one in. If you don't know, if you've never replaced a seal before, there's videos on it. This is as simple as it gets. Just make sure that it's pointing in the right direction. So you have that recessed part there. It's flat there. Also, you want to buy an auxiliary wiper lip seal. Probably Max Merit or somebody, or Cantor sells like the original felt type seals. You really shouldn't need one if you have the wiper lip, especially because this is on the output side. All the dirt's flying the other way, so to speak. But what we're going to do now is, well, first of all, let's thread the speedometer on. I already have this lubricated. So, got your shaft here. That drops in. You have the housing, the threads in. I'm going to do the final tightening on this in a second. We just have it hand tight for now because it's spun all the way down. See, that spins perfectly well, good. And then we take the other speedometer gear. There's actually no splines on this. It just gets held in place with friction. Slide that on, and then this thing will slide on as well. So as you can see, there's nothing to it in terms of the gears meshing. It just slides right on by hand. To attach our gasket here, I used Permatex shellac gasket compound. You just paint this stuff on. You want to use a fairly light coat, not extremely sparse, but something you can see through. That'll make the gasket stick on, and you can do that immediately before you assemble it. You don't have to do it in advance. I did it for this video, but normally you do it right before you stick the thing on there. I also applied shellac gasket compound to the threads of all the bolts here. As you can see, it's fairly sparse, just a little coat there, nothing too crazy. Don't forget the lock washers, and we'll thread these on here. Now this compound on the threads of the bolts is to keep oil from leaking past the threads of the bolts and causing a leak like that. So we're just going to start all these hand tight, and then run them down with the ratchet wrench. So if you are using Loctite, which you should not use Loctite in this application, I just mean in general, if you're using unexpired Loctite, that should not change the dry torque spec. That's what it's engineered to do. You can use the normal torque spec without any modification. For this, because we have this real thick stuff on here, this stuff will reduce your torque spec a little bit. Now, we're not using a torque wrench here. They didn't really even have them in 1937 for assembly, or I guess that was kind of the beginning of it. But anyway, you don't want to crank these down super tight. You want to go just maybe 10 or 15% less. So I'm getting them tight, but not like, I'm not killing them here. Take our flange here. You want to make sure you coat the splines with lubriplate, or you can use that lithium grease like I did before. These I already coated, but I'll just show you again. It's not going to hurt to have some extra on here. The purpose of this is so that you have this nice thick liquid in here to keep gear oil from seeping past the splines and leaking out that way. You also want to, you can see I already lubricated this. You want to put some pre-lubricant on the side of that there to get the seal nice and lubricated up. There we go, slides on super easy. If you have the felt type seal, it'll be a little more annoying to get that on. But now we can take our nut. Okay, when we have this nut screwed all the way down, okay, so for comparison, on a differential, the pinion nut is what this is called. That controls the pinion bearing preload. If the nut loosens up, you're going to have real quick problems real fast with your gears coming out of mesh, things like that. So the differential is critical. On a transmission, not so critical. And again, I don't think this is going to loosen, and we're going to take a precaution. It's just not going to be as extreme as the stuff we do on a differential to make sure it doesn't loosen up. On a differential, I like to replace this nut with a self-locking type. This technically is self-locking, but it doesn't work very well. On a transmission, we're just going to peen two of these, like right there. Once that nut's spun all the way on, we're just going to peen that and kind of stake the nut in place to help keep from loosening back up. Of course, we're also going to torque it down appropriately. So we can check that our transmission is working properly. I don't think the gears are in mesh here. Could be part of the problem. Let's see. Let's get that in neutral there. There we go. I don't have the shifter forks in, so the spin's perfectly fine when it's in neutral, as you can see. But with how some of these things are meshed right now, it's not too happy. But we will keep going. There we go. Spin's perfectly fine there as long as our gears are staying in the right spot. So we're going to go ahead and tighten this down. You can also, if you're concerned about the speedometer, look down there and eyeball that. But yeah, I'm just going to run this down with our socket wrench. You do need to have a thin wall socket on this. I use this Husky 1 1/4, part number CT 1240. You can find a 1 1/4 on a 1/2 inch drive. A lot of times that'll be the right sort of size. The 1 1/4 inch with the 3/4 drive a lot of times is way too thick to get these nuts on properly. Also, you can find this size of nut in just a thinner profile if you don't get that self-locking type. So when I'm done with this transmission, I'm going to put this in the vise, get that tightened down properly, and then stake it like I described. But that's not something we can really do right now. The other thing is I'm going to tighten that down in a minute. So now that we have the rear half put together, we're going to take our bearing in the front. Like I was saying before, we just took our lithium grease, packed the bearing. If you don't know how to pack a bearing, there's videos on it. But you basically just keep shoving grease in with your thumb until the grease starts to come out, and then you can spin the bearing to distribute the grease, shove more in. And whenever you shove grease in, it just keeps coming out one way or another, and you spin it, and it keeps doing that. You shove more grease in, it comes out, then it's completely packed. Really nothing much to it. So All we have to do now is get this front bearing on. For whatever reason, this one's a little stiffer. Not really sure why. I showed that on the rear one. I'm gonna do this off camera to drive this one in here so I don't have to do it with the camera in the way. Okay, I managed to get the camera over here to show you the technique on this one. Very simple, light hammer taps. You're going to press firmly with our thumb on one side and without skinning our knuckles, tap on the other side with the hammer. This will get it onto the shaft and into the bore at the same time. It's really quite easy. There we go. Very important, snap ring goes on there. Please do not forget that. I have my snap ring right here. This one actually came without a snap ring, so I got a new one from good old Max Merit. However, it's also a standard snap ring size. I'm pretty sure it is a nominal size 1 3/4 inch snap ring. So you can just check on that. Here we go. And then I think I'm not even to my snap ring groove quite yet. So we're just gonna slide this out slightly and make sure we have it fully tapped on the shaft there. I think that's on. Okay. You guys hopefully know how to get a snap ring on. This is another thing that's annoying to do. Not on camera, but I'll just cut back. Annoying to do on camera, so I'll do it off camera is what I meant to say. I'll cut back. So for getting the snap ring on, the trick is basically to get it started and press it on with your thumb while working the gap open with the screwdriver. Here we go. Now it's on. Next, we will install the input shaft cover. You notice there is this groove in here. This groove indexes with a hole in the case, which is right there. You can see there's that extra hole. So we just need to make sure the orientation is correct. Like I did before, I have my gasket pre-applied. Also, these grooves here, in case you're wondering, those are to help direct oil or grease back towards the inside of the case. When the car is moving forward, those will spin to pull oil in that way. So, our orientation here. You just put your finger on it, line her up. There we go. This one you can tap on with a hammer very gently if it doesn't go on easily on its own. And then we're just gonna put some of that shellac on our screws, screw them in, be done with that. Same way as putting the other side on. All right, so the only other real part of these is we have the shifter fork assembly. These almost never need anything done to them. So let me see if I can angle. These are so awkward for obvious reasons. You got the fork, you got the, what am I trying to say? The shifter arm there. Let me see if I can brighten this up a little bit. There we go. So to get these apart, there's plugs and things that have to come out. So unless there's something distinctly wrong with this, you can just wash it in the parts washer and basically reuse it. I also just want to point out, on camera, it looks like there's tons of rust here. There's really not. It's just because I have the camera exposure turned up way more than normal. It just makes it look like that. Just want to point that out because it looks like this is super rusty, but it's not. So we're just gonna put the gasket on this with our, what do we call it? Our shellac compound. Put that new gasket on there and bolt this back on. Obviously make sure the forks line up. Nothing too complicated about that. So before you attempt to attach your cover, you want to make sure that your larger shifting fork is in neutral. You'll see one groove there. There's 3 grooves in total. So one of them's in the detent and one of them's farther. If you push this way, then that'll be in the detent. It can go that way as well. So you see that one groove there, that's in neutral. You can also see, if I can get it on camera, you see what's rocking back and forth there. That's our shift lever itself that you hold. So this has to be in neutral so that you are here, because you can't have that shifted into a gear. This one can slide, so it doesn't particularly matter where your other where your other shifter fork is, as long as it ends up aligned with this, should be fine. And then once you have it attached, you can just shift into gear like normal to test it out. All right, we can bench test the transmission here. Basically the same as just driving it. Our H pattern is reverse, first, second, third. And second and third are synchro-meshed. So move to the left side, push all the way up. That's reverse. We can see there's a large speed difference here. It's also in the opposite direction. Pull down. We're now in first. Same direction, still a large speed difference. Bump right back to the middle. So we were over to the left, and then we're going to push it to the right. Firmly push up because it takes a little more force on second and third because you have the shifter fork as well as getting the the same thing I was talking about before with the springs and the bearing balls. You have to push that. So this is second. We're getting pretty close to direct drive here. As you can see, there's not that much of a speed difference. Then we pull it down into direct here. There we go. Now, sometimes when you shift back into neutral, you'll still have the shafts kind of locked up here. And that's because your synchronizer is sticking. So to free that up, if you want to literally be in neutral, so you can turn it by hand, just push it to the right slightly, wiggle it up and down a bit, move it back to the center. I didn't do it quite enough. And that'll break synchronizer free, so that you're in neutral again. That is pretty much it. What did I not show? We got the drain plugs. I put those in already, nothing to it. There's a boot that goes here. There is a little brass identification tab. And then the only other thing is we have to slide our lock plate in here and screw it down with the screw and the lock washer. So, and then that was the other thing. I need to tighten my speedometer up, tighten this up and peen it, the nut for the output shaft. That is it, guys. So I'm gonna do all that stuff off camera. It's very, very simple. And I've explained it in the past. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Questions or comments, put in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe for more like this. And I will catch you guys later.